As I was reading Jeff Kinley's The End of the World According to Jesus of Nazareth, I started thinking, I wonder how similar this book is to Hal Lindsey's famous The Late Great Planet Earth. Now, I've never read Lindsey's book, mostly because the only things I know about the book are that it sold millions of copies in the 70s and the 80s, and anti-dispensationalists use it to mock dispensationalism. So in my curiosity about the book, I went online to YouTube to see if anyone else has reviewed The Late Great Planet Earth with a video online, and no one has. The one sort of review I found of it was made by What When We Understand the Text, and in that video they accuse Hal Lindsey of being a false prophet. Now, I gotta say, the video had a rather weak accusation because the only quote in the video from Lindsey wasn't even from The Late Great Planet Earth, but another book which says, the decade of the 1980s could very well be the last decade of history as we know it. Now, if that's your quote to prove that Hal Lindsey is a false prophet, you're just trying to smear the guy because you don't like him or you don't agree with his teaching. You have no real basis for your accusation. But after watching that video, I decided, I gotta read The Late Great Planet Earth. If only for one reason. I'm reading this book hunting for false prophecies. And to be honest, I kind of expected to find some. I grew up in an independent Baptist fundamentalist church, and I remember hearing some pretty dumb stuff from prophecy watchers who came to visit at our church in the early 90s and talk about the end of the world. But I was pleasantly surprised and honestly a little invigorated reading Hal Lindsey's work. So if you have a few minutes, let me tell you what I took away from The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to learn about the end of the world, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with my most current book reviews. And also, please like and share this video with others to help them know about the work of Hal Lindsey. The first thing I want to say about this book is Lindsey makes it clear in The Late Great Planet Earth, he isn't a prophet. He was striving in this book to interpret the prophecies of the Bible. And whenever he presented theories of connecting his day and age with the language of the Bible, he always put it in language such as, this very well could be, or if we are right in the end. The closest thing he made to a prophecy in the entire book was when he wrote, since the restoration of Israel as a nation in 1948, we have lived in the most significant period of prophetic history. We are living in the times which Ezekiel predicted in chapters 38 and 39. As far as I could tell, this is the only time he made a definitive statement tying his time period to prophecy. And I think the vast majority of dispensationalists today would agree that if the rapture happened this week or even 10 years from now, and we saw wars in the end times of Russia, China, and an African or Muslim coalition, then a lot of what Lindsey predicted in this book was still right. So I wouldn't be so fast to call him a false prophet, first because the dots he was connecting might not be wrong still, and second, because he wasn't trying to be a prophet, but he was saying the Bible speaks of an army in the north and an army in the east. And what do we see in the world today, north and east of Israel? And the person who's doing this, I wouldn't call them a false prophet. Now, I am fairly certain that Lindsey probably thought that all of this would occur by 1988. The rapture would occur by then. I think he believed totally that that would happen based on what he wrote in the book, but there's no direct statement that the rapture would happen by 1988. And as I was reading, I could totally understand why Lindsey and others were so excited about the days in which they were living, and also why The Late Great Planet Earth sold millions of copies. Reading this book, the one impression that I have is that those who attack it so mercilessly are really looking back at it with an arrogance, to mock Hal's work and to mock it without appreciating the time in which he was writing. I remember, Israel was a nation. For the first time in 2,000 years, God was bringing the Jewish people back to that land in a way that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But then at the same time, there were also people who were predicting the regathering of Israel into the land for the last 150 years. And they were doing so thanks to a futuristic interpretation of Revelation and Ezekiel. And we forget today, I think, how improbable and miraculous it is for Israel to exist because we've been so accustomed to the nation today. And then on top of that, let's just be honest. Ezekiel describes a northern coalition. And I can't see how you can't dig into that terminology and not see it as a description of the northern lands that would end up becoming the Soviet Union. And then you have this European coalition starting to form. And it was a thrilling time to read Ezekiel and Revelation and then read your newspaper and see the parallels. And here's the thing. The coalition in Europe, has the nations of Europe grown closer together or farther apart? While Europe is probably weaker now than they were in the 60s and 70s, they're more unified today. Is Russia no longer a concern on the world scene? What about China? What about the Muslim nations? All of the issues that Hal talked about in the late great Planet Earth are not only here, but some of them point with even more clarity toward the nations mentioned in Ezekiel. Now that I've said that, let me tell you about my unusual way of looking at the end times. I don't know how many people hold this same view, but maybe I can get a couple of converts in this 10-minute book review. The view that I have came to me while I was reading about John Wycliffe and Martin Luther and their predictions about their time period being the end of our age. I believe God always has the world ready for the rapture and then the tribulation. Therefore, I think Satan also always has ready at least one, maybe more than one man ready to step up as the final antichrist, the beast. Therefore, we in the church should always be able to look around at the world today and say, Jesus could come back today. Luther could say it in his time, and we can say it in our own. So Lindsey and the other prophecy watchers that continue today, they are simply recognizing that the world is always ready for the end. And the pieces that God moved into place in the mid-20th century were eye-opening. And those pieces continue to sit ready and to be used at the end of days for the biblical narrative to happen. In fact, I think probably the most embarrassing thing about the late great Planet Earth were not the connections that Lindsey made between the early 70s and Ezekiel, but what made me cringe a little was when I read what Hal Lindsey wrote on Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, and wrote on famines coming because of overpopulation. We know that the real greatest false prophet of the 1970s was not Hal Lindsey, but Paul Ehrlich. So the fact that Lindsey took anything away from him is by far the biggest negative in the late great Planet Earth. Overall, I gotta say, this book was better than I expected. At times, though, it was actually surprisingly a little boring because a lot of this book is just pretty run-of-the-mill dispensational eschatology. But I do believe that critics of this book, the real reason they can't stand it is simply because it was popular. And things that are popular end up becoming easy targets simply because so many people have read it and enjoy it. But I do want to end by saying I think young dispensationalists would do well to give this book a chance. And all of us would do well to keep our eyes fixed on the fact that Jesus could come back today. He could come back tomorrow, or he could come back in 2,000 years.